The checkpoint at Fort Callahan had a smell I could have picked out of 100 others: diesel, cut grass, and the particular dust that only settles on a military road. I'd walked through that gate so many times over 4 years that my feet knew the way without my eyes. That morning, I held my son's hand in one of mine and a thermos in the other. Teddy had on the little navy button-down I'd bought him 2 days before, the one with the tiny anchors stitched along the collar. In the thermos was chicken and wild rice soup, simmered since 6 that morning with fresh thyme and a knuckle of ginger, because Grant had called the week before complaining his stomach had been in knots, and a friend of mine who'd gone to nursing school swore this recipe was the only thing that ever settled her father's ulcer. I'd skim the broth 3 times. I'd use the good thermos, the steel one from our wedding registry that nobody else was allowed to touch. "Mommy, will Daddy be happy?" Teddy asked, swinging our joined hands. "He is going to be so happy, baby." I smoothed his hair down where it always stuck up in the back. I was already picturing it. Colonel Grant Whitfield's stern face cracking into that rare, boyish grin he saved for me, and only me. The one that made him look 26 again instead of 38. We reached the guard booth. A soldier I didn't recognize, young enough that his uniform still looked a size too big on him, straightened at his post. "Good morning," I said, lifting the thermos slightly so he could see it. "I'm here to see the base commander, Colonel Whitfield. I'm his wife. I brought him lunch." Something moved behind the boy's eyes. A flicker. There, and gone. He picked up the handset on the guard shack phone, dialed an extension, and murmured a few words I couldn't quite catch. I heard "Commander's wife," and "at the front gate." And then his face did something strange. He hung up slowly, like the receiver had gotten heavier in the 90 seconds since he'd picked it up. "Ma'am." He wouldn't look at me now. "It might be best if you headed home." Headed home? I laughed. Actually laughed, because it seemed like such an obviously silly thing to say. "I'm not a visitor. I'm his wife. Just tell him I'm here. He'll want to see us." The soldier's ears went red. His mouth opened and closed twice before anything came out. "What is it?" My smile was already dying on my face. "Ma'am, I really can't let you through right now." He forced the rest out like it was physically painful. "The colonel has a personal guest on base. Visits are suspended for the day." A personal guest. Visits suspended. Those 5 words went into my ears like ice picks and straight down into my chest, freezing something solid on the way. It was late June, the asphalt shimmering with heat, 98 degrees according to my dashboard on the drive over, and I stood there at the gate of a United States Army installation shaking like it was February. I looked down at Teddy. He was watching the soldier, then me, then the soldier again. His 4-year-old face creased with the beginning of confusion, not yet understanding what had actually just happened to his morning. I crouched down in front of him and pressed my palms gently over his ears. "Teddy, baby, Mommy's just going to talk to this nice man for a second. Don't listen to the grown-up talk, okay? Count to 20 for me." He nodded, obedient as always, and started mouthing numbers. Still crouched, I looked up at the young private. From that angle, I should have looked smaller. Instead, something in my face made him take an involuntary step back toward the booth. "Say that again," I said. My voice came out so quiet I barely recognized it. "A personal guest, ma'am. I'm just relaying the order." "Whose order?" "Sergeant Briggs, ma'am. The colonel's aide." "Briggs." I said the name like I was spitting out a piece of gristle. I stood, took my phone from my bag, and dialed without looking at the screen. 2 rings. Well, look who's calling her big brother in the middle of a workday. Weston's voice was warm, teasing, the voice of a man who commanded an entire Army Corps and still had time to be soft with his baby sister. "Did that husband of yours put you in a mood again?" "Weston." I said each word with total precision, the way our father used to before he signed a contract he intended to enforce to the letter. I am standing at the front gate of Fort Callahan. Grant gave an order that I'm not allowed on base. He told them he has a personal guest inside. Silence stretched on the line. Weston Winthrop had given the Army 22 years, climbed from platoon leader to two-star general commanding an entire corps, and I knew him well enough to know that the quieter he got, the more dangerous he was. His voice, when it finally came, had dropped into something I could only describe as Arctic. Charlotte. That was the only time he ever used my full name. What do you need? I need the Winthrop family to look into this. All of it. I still had one palm clamped over Teddy's ear. With the other hand, I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles ached. I'll call Preston myself. And Margot. Grant Whitfield and whoever's on that base with him do not get to walk away from this. No mercy. Done. One word, and the line went dead. I put the phone away, crouched back down, and lifted my hands off my son's ears. Teddy blinked at me. Mommy, are we not going in? No, baby, we're not. I picked him up, 4 years old and already solidly heavy, all knees and elbows, and pressed my cheek to his warm little face. Mommy's going to take you home and make mac and cheese with bacon bits. Does that sound good? But what about Daddy's soup? I looked down at the thermos sitting on the pavement where I'd set it down. 6 hours of simmering, 3 skims, the good ginger. I'd driven 40 extra minutes out of my way that morning to buy the thyme fresh instead of using the dried stuff in my pantry. I drew my foot back and kicked it. The lid popped off and skittered across the asphalt. Broth the color of warm honey spread out in a widening stain, noodles and shredded chicken scattering into the dust and gravel at the base of the guard booth. The young soldier's mouth fell open. He didn't say a single word. Come on, Teddy. I turned and carried my son toward the parking lot, my heels striking the pavement in a hard, even rhythm. Click, click, click. Every step deliberate. Over my shoulder, Teddy looked back at the ruined thermos and said, in the small, serious voice only small children have, Mommy, that's a lot of wasted soup. I wouldn't feed it to a stray dog now, I told him, and buckled him into his car seat. I got behind the wheel but didn't start the engine right away. I sat there, staring at those gates. The same gates I'd driven through for 4 years while the soldiers on duty saluted and waved me through like I belonged. I had believed, foolishly, that the salute meant something. That I was one of them. I understood now that I never had been. A personal guest. I already had a good idea who that was. Vanessa Cole. Grant's childhood friend from the days when both their fathers had been stationed at the same base in Georgia, back before either of them had learned to shave. Their families had been close enough that Grant's mother used to joke, at Sunday dinners, that the two of them would end up married someday. Then Vanessa had gone overseas for graduate school and the joke had quietly died, the way old family jokes do. After Grant and I married, his mother brought Vanessa's name up exactly once. My older sister Margot had shut it down before the sentence finished. The past is the past, she'd said, in that flat, final tone she used in boardrooms. Grant is married to my sister now. I trust you understand the difference, Eleanor. At the time, I thought Margot had been unnecessarily harsh. I'd even pulled her aside afterward and asked her to be gentler with my mother-in-law. I believed, back then, that Grant's love for me was more than enough. That nothing from before mattered. 4 years. I had given him a son. I ran that household like a small business. Meal plans, appointments, his parents' medications, his father's hospital stay when I sat by the bed for 7 straight nights so Grant could sleep before an inspection. For his mother's 40th wedding anniversary, I had started planning a month out and hand-knit a cashmere shawl until my fingers cracked. Where had Vanessa Cole been while I was doing all of that? I didn't know yet. But I knew she was back now, and somehow, in the space of one summer, I had been quietly evicted from my own husband's life. I took out my phone and opened a new message to my oldest brother. Preston, I need a full workup on someone. Vanessa Cole, recently back from overseas. Everything. Who she's seeing, what she's doing, where she lives. Send. Then a second message, this one to Margot. Weston's already moving. I need you to pull every dollar, every contract, every credit line the Whitfield family has gotten through Winthrop Holdings. All of it, dated and itemized. Send. I dropped the phone on the passenger seat, put the car in reverse, and pulled out of that lot without a single glance back at the gate. Back home, I got Teddy out of his church clothes and into his dinosaur pajamas, even though it was barely noon, washed his hands, and set him up on the living room rug with a bowl of goldfish crackers and his favorite show. Then I went into our bedroom, opened the bottom drawer of my dresser, and pulled out a folder I hadn't touched in years. Inside was a stock transfer agreement. 15% of Winthrop Holdings, signed over to me by my father before he died, back when I was 22, and had never once thought about what a 15% stake actually meant. My brother Preston had run the company in the years since, and every quarter, like clockwork, a dividend deposit would appear in my account. I never even looked at the number. I never needed to. But there was one clause in that agreement I had never forgotten, because my father had made me read it aloud to him the day he signed it over. Any shareholder holding no less than 15% retains full veto rights over major corporate action. I ran my finger over my father's signature, the ink gone slightly amber with age, and something in my chest cracked open. Dad, I said quietly to an empty room. I promise you I won't embarrass you. The phone rang. Preston. Charlotte. His voice was level, deliberately level, the way all the Winthrop men got when they were trying very hard not to sound furious. The file on Vanessa Cole just landed in your inbox. Take a look, then call me back. I'll tell you now, though, her time overseas isn't clean. Officially, she was doing a master's in materials science. Unofficially, our people are already flagging some very strange affiliations. We'll have more in 3 days. Okay. I took a breath. There's something else, Preston. I want every contract, every investment, every dollar of credit the Winthrop Corporation has extended to the Whitfield family, pulled. A pause on the other end. When Preston spoke again, there was a smile in his voice, but it wasn't a warm one. You're sure? I'm sure. All right. A beat. When do you want to start? Now. I hung up and opened the file Preston had sent. Pages of it, resumes, photographs, a social network map with lines connecting names I'd never heard of. Vanessa Cole, 33, 2 years older than me. A master's degree in materials science from a university in Prague. 3 years at a private research firm afterward. Back in the States since January, working now at a small technology contractor headquartered less than a mile from Fort Callahan. I scrolled further and stopped cold on a photograph. It was grainy, taken at night under a street lamp. A man and a woman standing beside a dark green pickup. The man was Grant. The woman was Vanessa. His hand rested on the roof of the truck, his head bent low over hers. She had her chin tilted up toward him. The gap between their faces was less than the width of my hand. In the corner, a timestamp. 3 days earlier. 3 days earlier, Grant had texted me that he was slammed with a training exercise and asked me not to bother coming out to base that week. Said he'd be pulling long nights straight through Friday. So that was what his long nights looked like. I closed the laptop, leaned back, and shut my eyes. My thoughts were a wreck, and yet, somehow, perfectly clear at the same time. I remembered the night Grant proposed, 4 years earlier. Down on one knee in the parking lot outside his cousin's wedding reception, ring box open, and he'd said, I could still hear it exactly. Vanessa, will you marry me? My sister Margot had burst out laughing so hard she'd nearly dropped her champagne. You got the name wrong and you're still going through with it? Grant's face had gone crimson. He'd stammered apologies for a full minute. I'm so sorry, I'm just nervous, Charlotte. Will you marry me? We'd all laughed about it that night. Nerves, we said. Wedding jitters, we said. A slip of the tongue, nothing more. I opened my eyes. Vanessa. Charlotte. What a joke. My phone buzzed. Margot. I've got the numbers pulled. Her voice was crisp, all business. Preliminary list of what the Whitfields have gotten from us. 14 construction contracts totaling right around $280 million. 41 vendors, all longtime Winthrop partners. 6 bank guarantees. $92 million combined. She paused, and her voice iced over. There's something else you don't know. Richard Whitfield's company nearly went under 3 years ago. Preston personally authorized a $65 million injection to keep them solvent. When they took that money, they signed a performance covenant, hit a certain profit threshold within 3 years, or trigger a buyback clause. This is year 3, I said slowly. This is year 3, and they're nowhere close. Why did nobody tell me any of this? Preston didn't want to worry you. You'd just had Teddy. Your body was still recovering. We figured, they're family. We help family. Who could have predicted? She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Set up a call with Preston and Weston tomorrow evening, the old house, I said. I have an announcement to make. Done. A beat. Charlotte, whatever you decide, we're behind you. I hung up and went to check on Teddy. He was on the rug, hugging his stuffed rabbit, eyes glued to the television. When he saw me, he ran over and wrapped both arms around my leg. Mommy, I'm hungry. Mommy's making dinner right now. I knelt and lifted him, kissed his cheek. He looped his arms around my neck and said, in that small, solemn voice of his, Mommy, let's not go see Daddy anymore. I don't love Daddy anymore. I went very still. Why don't you love Daddy, baby? Because Mommy cried today. I hadn't cried. Not once. Not in front of him. But children see everything whether we let them or not. Okay, I whispered, hugging him tighter. We won't go see him anymore. That night, after I'd read Teddy 3 books and tucked him in, I sat alone on the back porch. My phone screen lit up. A text from Grant. Charlotte, I heard what happened at the gate today. Please don't read into it. Vanessa's company has a joint contract with the base. She's the project lead. She was here for work. I told the gate not to let anyone through because I didn't want distractions during the exercise. It had nothing to do with you. I'll be home in a few days and I'll explain everything. I read it twice, took a sip of water and typed back 5 words. Okay. Take care of business. Then I turned the phone face down on the table. Out past the porch railing, the neighborhood stretched into a warm summer dusk, lights coming on one by one in the windows of the houses around us. I had lived 31 years believing that if I worked hard enough at loving someone, they would love me back the same way. I had married Grant Whitfield thinking I'd finally found someone to lean on. I understood now that the only person I could ever really rely on was myself. The phone buzzed again. A short message from Weston. Cleanup has begun. Step 1. All linked accounts frozen. Step 2. All provided resources under revocation review. Step 3. Awaiting your call. I typed back 1 word. Acknowledged. Then I opened my message history with Grant. 4 years of good mornings and good nights and grocery lists and photos of Teddy, and deleted every single thread. I didn't sleep much that night, and I was awake again before 6 the next morning when my phone started buzzing against the nightstand in a pattern too dense to be an alarm. Messages, one after another, all from my mother-in-law. Charlotte, what on earth is going on? Why did your brother pull the funding on Richard's projects? Do you understand he's been fighting for that contract for 6 months? And you just yank it out from under him? Is this how the Winthrop family does business? Answer me right now. I sat up against the headboard and read every message from the first to the last without responding to any of them. I was still holding the phone when it rang in my hand. Grant Whitfield, the screen read. I looked at those 2 words for 3 full seconds before I answered. Charlotte, have you lost your mind? His voice tore out of the speaker before I'd even said hello. He rarely spoke to me like that. In 4 years of marriage, he'd always been the mild one, the one who apologized first even when he hadn't done anything wrong. Good morning to you too, Grant. My father just called me in a panic. Winthrop pulled every dollar overnight. Do you have any idea what that does to a company mid-construction? I have a pretty good idea, actually. Charlotte. His voice dropped, trying for reasonable. Is this about yesterday? I already explained. Vanessa's company has a joint project with the base. I didn't want distractions. It wasn't personal. Grant. I cut him off, my voice perfectly even. I have a question for you, and I want you to actually think before you answer. Have you kissed her since she got back? Dead silence on the line. The kind of silence that belongs to a man who's been struck somewhere tender and hasn't had time to invent a lie, but is too afraid to tell the truth either. You have, I answered for him. More than once. Charlotte, that's not... Second question, I said, not letting him finish. 3 nights ago, Monday, where were you at 9:30? Another silence, longer this time. Are you having me followed? His voice had gone low and cornered. Having you followed. I love that you think you're worth the effort, Grant. I laughed, and even I didn't like the sound it made. You don't even know the half of what you've got to answer for. Nothing happened between us, he blurted, and then went quiet, because the sentence had come out sounding exactly like what it was, a confession dressed up as a denial. I didn't say her name, I said softly. You did that all on your own. You're twisting this. You're provoking me. I'm not provoking anything. I'm telling you that if the shoe fits, you should probably just wear it. I could hear him breathing hard, pacing, the particular rhythm of a man cornered in his own office. Then the pacing stopped, and his tone softened, syrupy and pleading. Charlotte, I'll admit I've seen her a few times. We caught up. We grew up together. She came back into town. She invited me to dinner. What was I supposed to do? Be rude to an old friend? Please don't make this into something it isn't. You and Teddy are the only ones in my heart. Caught up. Invited me to dinner. You and Teddy are the only ones in my heart. Such tired, well-worn lines. Every cheating husband in every made-for-TV movie says exactly that. Grant, I said instead, do you know what Teddy asked me yesterday? A pause. What did he ask? He asked if his daddy still loved us. And then he told me he doesn't want to come see you anymore. He's 4 years old, Grant, and he already understands more than you're giving him credit for. When you told your aide not to let me on base, did it once occur to you that your son was standing there too? Did you think, even for a second, about what it would do to him to watch his own mother turned away at the gate? His voice actually cracked. I wasn't thinking about that. Charlotte, I'm sorry. I never meant for it to go that way. It doesn't matter anymore, I said, and I meant it. You don't matter anymore. I hung up, powered the phone off, and set it face down on the bed. On the nightstand sat the stock transfer agreement I'd forgotten to put away the night before. I flipped to the last page. My father's signature was still there, faded but unmistakable. Dad, you always said no Winthrop woman has to swallow an insult, I said to the empty room. You're not here anymore, but I'm not going to be the one who breaks that. I powered my phone back on and called Margot. I need every line of that profit covenant spelled out for me. Exact terms, exact consequences if they miss the target. Everything. Already done. My sister's voice was crisp as ever. 3 years ago, when Preston put in the $65 million, the Whitfields signed a covenant guaranteeing $85 million in net profit within 3 years. Based on the reports I pulled yesterday, their 3-year cumulative profit is $48 million, not even half. Under the covenant's default clause, Winthrop Holdings can demand a full buyback of our position at original value, plus a 20% penalty, payable within 90 days. If they can't produce the funds, we take the company's assets outright. A pause, and something almost hungry crept into her tone. I already ran the math. $65 million principal plus a 20% penalty comes to $78 million. In their current position, they couldn't scrape together 10. Good, I said. One more thing. Put together a single document. Every resource, every contract, every loan, every guarantee they've received from us over the last 3 years. Dated, itemized, with names attached. What for? So everyone can see exactly how the Whitfield family climbed on the back of ours, and how they paid us back for it. Silence on the other end. Charlotte. Margot's voice warmed unexpectedly. Have you really thought this through? Once you take this step, there's no going back to Grant. Margot, I said. The day he gave that order at the gate, the road back was already closed. She didn't try to talk me out of it after that. The women in this family have never once asked you to look back. You'll have the documents by lunch, she said, and hung up. I went to the kitchen to make Teddy breakfast, scrambled eggs, toast cut into triangles, warm milk in his dinosaur cup. He climbed into his booster seat on his own and waited patiently while I set the plate in front of him. Are we going to daycare today, Mommy? We are. I ruffled his hair. Eat up, and then Mommy will drop you off. He took a bite of toast and, cheeks stuffed, mumbled something I almost didn't catch. Mommy, a man called the house phone yesterday. I went still. What man, baby? He said his name was Sergeant Briggs, and that he works with Daddy. He asked if you were home. I told him you were tucking me in, and he hung up. Sergeant Briggs. The same aide who'd relayed Grant's order at the gate. Why on earth was he calling our house? I sat down across from Teddy, trying to keep my face neutral. Did the man say anything else? No. He shook his head. He just asked if you were home. I stood up, some internal alarm going off low and steady. Briggs wouldn't have called on his own initiative. He only did what Grant told him to. Had Grant asked him to check whether I was home, to see if I'd gone somewhere, or to get ahead of me before I started digging? I went into the bedroom and started searching. Closets, drawers, the file cabinet in the study. Half an hour in the very bottom drawer of Grant's desk, I found an envelope that hadn't been sealed. I pulled out the papers inside. A life insurance policy. Policyholder, Grant Whitfield. Insured, Grant Whitfield. Beneficiary, Vanessa Cole. I read it 3 times. Date of issue, 3 months earlier. Coverage amount, $2 million. Relationship to insured in the little box on the form, friend. He had a wife, he had a 4-year-old son, and the beneficiary was a friend. My hands were shaking as I held the pages, not from fear, from something colder than that, something that settled into my bones like frost. 3 months ago, he'd been coming home like clockwork every evening, a late night here and there, a business trip once or twice. Nothing that raised a flag. The only thing different, apparently, was that 3 months ago he'd taken out a new policy and written another woman's name on it. I photographed every page and sent them to Margot. She called back within 3 minutes. Charlotte, don't do anything yet. Her voice was steel. Put the policy back exactly where you found it, don't spook them. I've already got the lawyers pulling every Whitfield contract. Our top divorce attorney will reach out this afternoon. Right now, I need you to do one thing. Find out if he's transferred any other assets we don't know about." She paused. "And one more thing. Weston already called Grant's commanding officer this morning. Every piece of equipment and every dollar of funding Winthrop provided for his exercise gets clawed back as of today. Whether he keeps his command is entirely up to him to figure out." I hung up, slid the policy back into its envelope exactly as I'd found it, and closed the drawer. Then I took Teddy to daycare. In the car, Teddy sat in his booster seat, swinging his legs and humming to himself, sunlight striking his round little cheeks through the window, his eyelashes long and curled like something out of a shampoo commercial. Watching him in the rearview mirror, I thought about the day I'd first held him, 4 years ago, so small and furious and pink, screaming like a tiny blind kitten. Grant had stood at the side of the hospital bed holding him awkwardly, eyes rimmed red, and said, "Charlotte, thank you." He'd promised, that day, to take care of me for the rest of my life, promised our son would grow up the happiest kid in the world. 4 years later, the man who'd made those promises had written another woman's name on a $2 million policy. After daycare drop-off, I didn't go home. I drove straight to Winthrop Tower in the financial district, up to the top floor where Preston's office looked out over 3 sides of the city. He was on a call when I walked in. He waved me toward the couch. His desk was buried in documents, a tangle of shareholder structure charts glowing on his monitor. He finished the call and came around to sit across from me. "The team's done with Vanessa Cole." He got straight to it, sliding a folder across the coffee table. During her years abroad, her research work was tied closely to foreign defense development programs. When she came back stateside, she took a position at a contractor whose primary shareholder happens to be a distant cousin of Grant's. I opened the folder and started reading. Here's the important part. Preston flipped to the last page and tapped a paragraph. "The program Vanessa currently leads is a technology cooperation agreement with Grant's Base. Contract value, $82 million. Except based on our own intelligence, her company's actual technical capacity isn't worth a fraction of that." "Are you saying they're laundering money through the contract?" Preston's eyes went flat. "What do you think?" Everything clicked into place at once. Vanessa's sudden return, the base project under Grant's command, the $82 million technology contract. Vanessa's company sitting at the center of all of it. The dots lined up into a single straight arrow, and the arrow pointed directly at Grant Whitfield. "Preston, is this enough?" He gave me a small, cold smile, the exact smile Weston wore, the family smile, confident, patient, merciless. "Not yet. Add the profit covenant. Add the insurance policy. Add today's funding pull. The Whitfields won't make it 3 more days." His phone buzzed. He answered, listened, and his smile widened. He hung up and said, "Richard Whitfield's downstairs, making a scene in the lobby." "Why would he come here?" "Why do you think?" "To beg?" Preston stood and adjusted his cufflinks. "Come watch." In the elevator, he glanced down at me. "Scared?" I shook my head. The doors opened onto the main lobby. Richard Whitfield stood in the center of the marble floor, flanked by 2 security guards, his shirt wrinkled through with sweat, hair standing up on one side like he'd been running his hands through it for an hour. He looked nothing like the composed businessman I'd known for 4 years. He saw me step out of the elevator and lunged forward. "Charlotte, honey, please, talk to your brother. You can't just cut the funding. If construction stops, we're finished. Our whole family." His voice cracked and broke. "I know Grant messed up. I'll knock some sense into him myself. But you can't do this to us. Mr. Whitfield." I kept my voice level, empty of feeling. "You say Grant messed up. Messed up how exactly?" Richard opened his mouth and found nothing to put in it. Preston stepped in, breezy, like he was making small talk about the weather. "Before he came here, He called Grant. Want to guess what Grant told him? That he'd done nothing wrong and my sister was overreacting. Richard's face drained of color. You and your son decided that because a Winthrop daughter married in, she became your property, Preston said, taking a step closer, standing a full head taller than the older man. That you could treat her however suited you. Mr. Whitfield, you're a businessman. In business, everything is reciprocal. You took everything the Winthrops had to offer and paid us back by mistreating our sister. Did you actually believe that kind of deal existed anywhere in the world? Richard's lips trembled. Preston took a document from an assistant and pressed it into his hands. The financing agreement from 3 years ago. Your term's up. You're $37 million short of target. Under the covenant, you owe us a full buyback plus a 20% penalty within 90 days. $78 million. Total. Richard's hands shook so hard the paper crackled audibly. $78 million? Where in God's name are we supposed to find that kind of money? Then we proceed under the contract, Preston said, without a trace of feeling. Winthrop Holdings will move to seize the company's assets in full. Richard staggered like he'd been hit. He looked at Preston, then at me, his mouth working for a long moment before anything came out. Charlotte, you can't do this. You're our daughter-in-law. I looked at his ruined, desperate face and found not 1 ounce of pity anywhere inside me. Mr. Whitfield, I said, when Grant gave the order not to let me on base, was he thinking about me being your daughter-in-law? He had no answer. When he wrote Vanessa Cole's name on a life insurance policy, was he thinking about me being his wife? Richard's eyes went wide with shock. He genuinely hadn't known. Your family never once considered me one of your own, I said, enunciating every word. So don't ask me for mercy now. I turned and walked back toward the elevator. Behind me, I heard Richard shouting something, but the elevator doors closed before I caught the words, and the soundproofing did the rest. Preston stood beside me. After a silent moment, he said, "The lawyer will reach out this afternoon. Have you thought through the divorce terms?" "There's nothing to think through. I already know what I want." "And custody?" "Custody is mine. Full stop." I watched the floor numbers tick down on the display. Grant Whitfield can't even dream about that. By the time I got home, it was already evening. I sat in the living room with a stack of papers spread across the coffee table. Contracts, the insurance policy, Vanessa's dossier, the Whitfields' financial statements. Each page felt like a blade, and every one of them was pointed at the same man. Outside, the sky went dark and the city lights blinked on one after another. My phone rang. "Weston." "Phase 1's complete," he said, voice firm and certain. "Every account Grant has tied to our corporation is frozen. Funding for his exercise has been pulled. Command's already aware. They called an emergency meeting this afternoon and hauled Grant in for it." A pause. "His authority as base commander's been temporarily suspended pending review." Suspended. The exact status he'd left home early and come back late for, night after night. The status he'd apparently valued above his wife and his son. The status that had let him walk his childhood friend onto a secured military installation and given him the nerve to turn his own family away at the gate. "Weston," I said, "that's not enough." He laughed, short and hard. "Of course it isn't. This is just step 1. Watch, little sister." I didn't have to wait long. The next morning, a call came in from an unknown number. "Is this Mrs. Whitfield?" A middle-aged man's voice, official but with a faint fawning edge underneath. "This is Colonel Mitchell from Base Command. Tomorrow at 10:00 hours we're holding a formal award ceremony. Colonel Whitfield is among the honorees. We'd like to invite you to attend as his spouse, if that's convenient." A formal ceremony. An honoree. I held the phone and had to fight down the urge to laugh out loud. "Colonel," I said, "I would not miss it for anything." I hung up and sat there for a long moment, turning the invitation over in my mind, feeling something settle inside me. Cold, clean, and absolutely certain. I spent that evening deciding what to wear, which felt, in hindsight, like an almost comically small thing to be deciding given everything else happening around me. In the end, I chose an emerald green dress I'd bought for an anniversary dinner. Grant and I never got around to having floor length, the kind of cut that made you stand up a little straighter just putting it on. I had my hair done. I put on the diamond earrings his mother had given me at our wedding, the ones she'd said belonged to a Whitfield bride and a Whitfield bride only. I wanted her to see them on me one last time. Margot came by that morning to help me get Teddy settled with our mother for the day. She looked me over in the dress and just nodded once, the way our father used to nod at a plan he approved of without needing it explained to him. "You look like you're going to war," she said. "I am," I told her. The drive out to Fort Callahan took 40 minutes. I sat in the passenger seat of the car service with the folder of documents in my lap. The insurance policy, the profit covenant breakdown, a flash drive Weston had couriered over the night before with an audio file on it I still hadn't let myself listen to all the way through. I watched the trees blur past outside the window and thought about nothing at all, which was its own kind of relief. The base auditorium was already half full by the time I arrived, rows of dress uniforms and a scattering of spouses in their good clothes, everyone murmuring in that low, polite hum particular to formal military functions. An usher checked my name against a list and walked me to a seat near the back. I didn't argue. Near the back suited me fine. A woman beside me leaned over as I sat. "You're Mrs. Whitfield, aren't you? That's a gorgeous dress." "Thank you," I said, and smiled at her the way I'd smiled at 1,000 officers' wives before. "I saw the list of honorees," she went on, oblivious. "Your husband's getting the top award. They're saying his technology cooperation program is the most important thing to come out of this base all year. Is that right?" I kept smiling. "That is quite an accomplishment." The ceremony began. Speeches from the base leadership, dry reports on readiness numbers, polite applause rolling through the room in waves. Grant's name came up twice before he was even called to the stage, and each time the room clapped like he'd personally invented the concept of national defense. He sat in the front row with his spine perfectly straight, his profile calm and composed, every inch the officer his father had always wanted him to be. I looked at him and thought about the first time I'd ever seen him, 4 years earlier, standing in a crowd of cadets at a graduation ceremony, seeming, at the time, to glow slightly brighter than everyone around him. My father had pointed him out to me. "Charlotte, that young man is going to go far." "Dad," I thought, "if you're watching this from somewhere, you're about to be disappointed in me." And now, a few words from Base Commander, Colonel Grant Whitfield. Applause thundered through the hall. Grant stood, buttoned the top of his jacket, and walked to the podium with a crisp, confident stride. He surveyed the room, a polite smile settling over his face, like it had been waiting there the whole time. "Distinguished guests, fellow officers." His voice, low and practiced, carried easily through the speakers. "It's a genuine honor to stand up here today. None of the progress we've made on this program would have been possible without the support of Command and the tireless work of everyone under me." He paused, and something in his tone warmed. "And, of course, without the full partnership of Ms. Vanessa Cole. As program lead on the contractor side, she's brought technology to this base that's put us years ahead of schedule, and I want to say, personally, how grateful I am to her." The room clapped again. I sat in the back row and slowly brought my hands together 3 times, applauding on my own private beat. Then I stood up. The emerald fabric caught the stage lighting and threw it back cold. I started walking down the center aisle toward the podium, heels striking the floor in a hard, unhurried rhythm. Click, click, click. Heads began turning. First a few, then dozens. Grant was still talking into the microphone when his voice caught, stumbled, and died. He'd seen me. His expression cycled through 3 different states in under a second. Surprise, panic, a forced attempt at composure. His hand tightened on the podium until his knuckles went white. I didn't stop walking. I passed row after row of watching faces, a low murmur following me down the aisle like a tide coming in. I reached the foot of the stage and stood still. Charlotte. Grant said my name into the live microphone, and it rang out through the whole auditorium. What are you doing here? I didn't answer him. I turned instead to face the room, all those rows of eyes. Distinguished guests, fellow officers. My voice wasn't loud, but the room had gone so silent that every word carried all the way to the back wall. I'm Colonel Whitfield's wife, Charlotte Winthrop. It may not be my place to speak here, but there's a great deal I've been carrying around, and I've decided today is the day I put it down. The murmur climbed. You just heard the Colonel thank Vanessa Cole. She is, in fact, exactly what he called her, his childhood friend. They grew up on the same base. Their families were close, and he never once hid the fact that they were close from me. Grant's face twisted. He stepped forward and hissed under his breath, though the microphone still caught it. Charlotte, get off this stage. We'll talk at home. I gave him a single glance, and something in it made him take an involuntary half-step back. What he did hide from me, I went on, turning back to the room, was how many times he's seen her since she came back into the country. And the fact that after 4 years of marriage, he took out a $2 million life insurance policy with a beneficiary who is not his 4-year-old son, not his wife, his childhood friend. I held up my phone. The screen displayed a clear photograph of the policy, and someone near the front had the presence of mind to relay it to the person beside them, and within seconds the room had erupted into noise. An insurance policy? Cole's the beneficiary? That can't be right. Grant's face had gone the color of ash. In 2 strides he was in front of me, reaching for the phone. I stepped back, and he stumbled, the tails of his jacket flying up in a way that would have been comic in any other circumstance. Charlotte. His voice cracked with something close to panic. Not here. Not here? I raised my voice for the first time. Grant, 2 days ago I brought our son to your front gate with a hot lunch, and you had your own aide turn us away because your childhood friend was inside. It was 98 degrees. Your son stood there and asked me if his daddy stopped loving us. The room went dead silent. Not a murmur, not a whisper. The total suspended silence of hundreds of people holding their breath at once. Grant's throat worked. He opened his mouth to say something and, under the weight of every eye in the auditorium, apparently found he couldn't produce a single word. I grew up in the Winthrop family, I said, scanning the rows of stunned faces. My parents raised us on one principle above all others: fairness. So I won't stand here and read out every single thing the Whitfield family has taken from mine over the years. 14 construction contracts worth $280 million, 41 vendor relationships, $92 million in bank guarantees. 3 years ago, when Richard Whitfield's company was on the verge of collapse, it was my older brother who personally authorized $65 million to keep it afloat. I let that number sit in the air for a second. $65 million would set an ordinary family up for 10 lifetimes. We gave it without a second thought because Grant was my husband. And how did his family pay us back? I took out a second document, holding it up so the light caught the letterhead. That money came with a performance covenant, 3 years, a profit target, a buyback clause, if they missed it. They didn't come close. As of this morning, the Whitfield family owes Winthrop Holdings $78 million, and they do not have it. Someone near the front audibly gasped. The Winthrop family didn't crush them for it, I continued. We didn't want to put me in the middle of a business dispute. So what did Grant do instead? I turned to face him directly. He stood under the stage lights, sweat beading along his hairline, his uniform still perfectly pressed, but every ounce of command presence drained out of him. One of the senior officers seated on the dais rose to his feet, face dark with anger. "Whitfield, is what your wife is saying true?" Grant didn't answer. He looked at me instead, and his expression held everything at once: fear, humiliation, anger, and, underneath all of it, something close to pleading. "One more thing," I said, and opened an audio file on my phone. "This is a recording of a conversation between Grant and Vanessa Cole from 2 nights ago. I don't know how it ended up on my phone. Maybe someone finally got tired of watching all this happen." I looked back out at the room. Would anyone care to hear it? Grant's face went gray. "Charlotte, don't." I pressed play. Vanessa's voice came through first, warm and low and deliberately intimate, amplified through the auditorium speakers for every person in that room to hear. "Donnie, your wife isn't going to make a scene about what happened at the gate, is she? I really was just there for work. I had no idea she was coming. I would never have shown up if I'd known." Then Grant's voice, tired, reassuring. "It's fine. That's just how she gets. Don't worry about it." But she poured the soup out on the pavement. I wanted to explain, and she wouldn't even listen to me. "Honestly, do you deal with tantrums like that at home too?" "Enough. Don't talk about her like that." A short pause. Then Vanessa's voice again, quieter, with the faintest thread of a laugh underneath it. "Donnie, tell me the truth. If I hadn't gone overseas back then, would it be me standing next to you right now instead of her?" Silence. No answer from Grant came through the speakers at all. That silence said more than any sentence could have. The recording ended, and the auditorium fell into a quiet so complete you could have heard a pin land. Every eye in the room was fixed on Grant. His hands trembled. His mouth trembled. He looked at me like a man watching his entire world collapse in real time, left with nothing but the raw fear of public disgrace. I put the phone away. My voice, when it came, was as calm as still water. "Grant, you told me once you'd take care of me, that you'd give our son a complete family. What you actually did was order your men to lock me out of your base. You put another woman's name on a $2 million insurance policy. And you stayed silent, dead silent, when she asked if she could have been standing where I was, because somewhere in your heart, you already knew the answer." I lifted my hand and slid off my wedding ring. In front of every officer in that room, I set it down on the edge of the stage. Click. Small sound, but the mic beside it picked it up and carried it out to every corner of the hall. "Colonel Whitfield, I have no more use for you." The room broke into chaos. People jumped to their feet. Phones came out. Somewhere near the front, a senior officer strode up to Grant and demanded, through his teeth, that he explain himself. Grant stood frozen, staring at me, his expression holding every emotion a person can hold at once, and none of them able to make it into words. I turned to the crowd once more and gave a small, formal bow. "I apologize for interrupting your ceremony. I take full responsibility for every word I've said today. All of this evidence has already gone to the Inspector General's office and Army Counterintelligence. I'll let the process decide the rest." I straightened, looked at Grant one final time, and said, "Goodbye, Colonel." Then I turned and walked out, the hem of my dress sweeping the floor in time with my steps. Click, click, click. Behind me, the hall kept roaring, shouted questions, camera shutters, the endless whisper of a few hundred people trying to process what they'd just watched. Someone called my name. I didn't turn around. Outside, the June sun hit me full in the face, bright enough to sting my eyes, though I wasn't crying. I walked down the tree-lined path to the parking lot, unfamiliar soldiers watching me pass with open curiosity. I reached my car, got in, and closed the door, and the noise of the entire world outside went instantly, completely quiet. I sat with both hands on the wheel and stared straight ahead for a long moment before I finally lowered my forehead onto the steering wheel and covered my face with both hands. The phone rang. Margot. Charlotte, Weston just got word. Her voice rang with something close to triumph. Grant's award was pulled on the spot. IG and CI are already conducting preliminary interviews, his command authorities suspended, and the tech contract with Cole's company is frozen pending investigation. Good, I said. Anything else? Margot paused. The IRS and the FBI's Economic Crimes Division just executed a raid on Cole's company. Preston says the paper trail they're finding could put her away for years, at minimum. Understood. I lifted my head and started the engine. I'm going to go pick up Teddy. The engine turned over, low and steady. I put the car in drive and pulled slowly out through the base gates. In the rearview mirror, they shrank smaller and smaller behind me. This time, nobody stopped me. Margot called again on the drive to daycare. There's an update from the tax audit, she said, and her voice actually trembled with something like excitement, which was rare enough for my sister that I knew it had to be significant. Cole's company accounts show the $82 million from the government contract, but the money movement afterward is completely illegal. $4 million routed to an offshore account under a shell name, another $600,000 transferred directly into her personal account. Is that enough to put her away? Enough? Margot let out a short, humorless laugh. That's a major white-collar case on its own. We're talking 10 years federal, at a bare minimum. Not enough, I said. Margot went quiet for a second. You have something else? I do. I gripped the wheel, stopped at a red light 2 blocks from the daycare. Preston mentioned her past overseas was murky. I want to know exactly how murky. He's already working it. Says he'll have something by end of day. Tell him I need it today. Not tomorrow. Today. The light turned green. I pulled into the daycare lot. Teddy's classroom was on the 3rd floor. I climbed the stairs and found him through the door window, hunched over a little table, tongue poking out in concentration, gripping a crayon like it owed him money. His teacher came over as I signed him out. Teddy drew a family portrait today, she said. He told me he's giving it to his mommy. A family portrait. I took the paper from her. 3 figures in crayon, 1 big, 1 medium, 1 tiny between them, each with a smile shaped like an upside-down crescent moon. Mommy, Teddy, and, off to the side, a dog we didn't own. Where's Daddy? I asked him later, in the car. He shook his head and said, in that solemn little boy voice, Daddy made Mommy cry. I don't want Daddy in the picture. I pulled him into my arms and buried my face against his small shoulder. He smelled like baby soap and that particular milky little kid scent that always made my throat tighten. Let's go home, I said. Back home, I got Teddy settled with his building blocks and went into my study to open my laptop. An email sat waiting from Preston. Subject line, Vanessa Cole. I opened the attachment, a dossier heavier than the last one, and scrolled until I hit page 3. A scanned document, 5 years old, bearing the letterhead of a European Research Institute. Vanessa Cole listed as the 4th name on a development team. The project title, circled in red by Preston himself, Export of Restricted Grade Defense Materials Technology. I scrolled further. A customs record. In the 3 months before her return to the States, Vanessa had flown 4 separate times to a country under strict international arms control sanctions. A 3rd document. An email. Sender, Vanessa. Recipient. An anonymous overseas address. The body contained a single damning line. Samples routed through the 3rd party as discussed. I read the whole file 3 times, then called Preston. "I've seen everything," I said. My brother's voice, when he answered, was ice over something simmering underneath. "What do you think?" "I think she isn't running a business. I think she's running an operation." A pause on his end. When he spoke again, the words seemed to come out through clenched teeth. "You're right. Her overseas project's on a sanctions list. Right before she came back to the States, critical material samples went missing from that lab. Interpol's still chasing it down. And she's brought whatever this is straight onto Grant's base, through his own contract. She's been feeding this development pipeline directly into military logistics." Preston exhaled slowly. "Do you understand what that means?" "Of course I do. It means Grant Whitfield didn't just cheat on his wife. He got used. Whatever he thought their history meant to her, she used it as a foothold to smuggle something forbidden into a place where it was never supposed to go." "Did he know?" I asked. "Based on the paper trail, probably not," Preston said. "But ignorance doesn't excuse a program lead. Every approval on that contract ran through his signature. If he let his feelings blind him to due diligence, he'll answer for that regardless." "Is it enough for a criminal case?" "More than enough. But there's a complication." "What complication?" "Jurisdiction. This touches military installations and national security. Regular civilian law enforcement can't move on this alone. To get Cole, we need the FBI and Army counterintelligence involved directly." "Can Weston make that happen?" Preston was quiet for a moment, and then, in a tone that told me the wheels were already turning, he said, "Give him an hour." It took less than an hour in the end. Weston called back, sounding like a man watching a plan click into place piece by piece. "FBI's economic crimes and counterintelligence units are moving on Cole's company this afternoon," he said. "I'm heading over myself to observe. You should come." I hadn't expected that, but I didn't hesitate either. I dropped Teddy with our mother and drove to the tech contractor's headquarters, a glass building 15 minutes from the base, all mirrored windows and a lobby with more marble than the building probably needed. Weston was waiting outside in his dress uniform, 2 stars gleaming on each shoulder, flanked by a small cluster of agents in plain windbreakers with FBI stenciled across the back. He looked, as always, like a man built specifically to make other people nervous. "You didn't have to come," he said when he saw me. "I wanted to." We rode the elevator up to the 16th floor together. Vanessa's office sat at the far end of an open floor plan, glass-walled, her name in brushed steel lettering on the door. Through the glass I could see her at her desk, phone pressed to her ear, laughing at something. Weston didn't knock. He opened the door and stood in the frame, filling it entirely. "Ms. Cole." She looked up, phone still at her ear, and her expression shifted through confusion into something sharper when she registered the stars on his shoulders and the agents fanning out behind him. "I'll call you back," she said into the phone and hung up slowly. "Can I help you, General?" "Vanessa Cole." He said her name flatly, without inflection. "Grant Whitfield. Are you aware of where he is right now?" Something in her face flickered. Weston took out his own phone, dialed, and set it on speaker on her desk without asking permission. "Colonel Mitchell, this is General Winthrop. Where is Colonel Whitfield at this moment?" Mitchell's voice came through tired and clipped. "General, sir, Whitfield was relieved of duty yesterday following the ceremony. As of 0800 this morning, he's confined to quarters pending court-martial proceedings. Investigators from the JAG office and Army CI are conducting interviews now. Primary focus is his negligence in approving the technology contract with Ms. Cole's company." The speaker carried Mitchell's words out across the whole office floor. Every employee within earshot had stopped typing. Vanessa's face went from pale to gray, like someone had poured ice water straight down her spine. "No," she said, her voice shrinking. "He promised he'd protect me. He promised." She kept mumbling, quieter and quieter, until she folded down into her chair entirely, her carefully done makeup running under a cold sweat, mascara tracking down both cheeks. I looked at her and felt no satisfaction in it at all. Just a kind of clean, cold clarity. "Vanessa," I said. She lifted her eyes to mine, dazed. "You asked him once if it would be you standing next to him if you'd never left. It doesn't matter what he thinks the answer is. What matters is that what you've actually done has bought you a one-way ticket to federal prison for a very long time." Her eyes widened. I stepped closer. "Did you get close to him because you cared about him?" I asked. "Or because he happened to be a commander sitting on top of a technology contract you needed?" Her lips trembled and produced nothing. Her face answered for her. Weston gestured, and 2 agents moved to either side of her chair. "Ms. Cole, you'll need to come with us." The whole office watched her walk out flanked by agents, her face gray, her hair coming loose from its clip, one shoe lost somewhere along the way, so she limped out half barefoot across the marble. The same co-workers who'd been fawning over her a week earlier now sat frozen behind their monitors, not daring to look up. I stood at the office door and watched her go. Preston called before we'd even made it back to the elevator. "Charlotte, excellent news!" His voice rang with open triumph. "The Bureau's taken over Cole's file entirely. The white-collar angle just got reclassified as espionage and material support to a sanctioned foreign program. Her hidden accounts, her contacts overseas, all of it's under a microscope now. Interpol's moving on the network she was feeding. Grant's looking at a minimum of a month under investigation. If he's lucky, he walks away demoted and dishonorably discharged. If he's not, he didn't finish the sentence." I walked to the window at the end of the hallway. New York spread out beneath me like a map, and somewhere out past the edge of the skyline sat the base. Those gates I'd walked through for 4 years now shrunk down to a gray speck too small to matter. "Will you ever go back there?" Weston asked, coming up beside me. "No." "What about your things?" "I don't need any of it. Just Teddy's things." He was quiet for a moment, then reached over and patted the top of my head, something he hadn't done since I brought home my first report card with all A's on it. "Let's go home," he said. We drove back into the city together. Halfway there, Weston said, out of nowhere, "Do you remember what Dad wrote for you in his will?" I went still. I'd been 12 when our father died. The will had been addressed to Preston, but my brother told me years later that at the very end there had been one line meant only for me. "If Charlotte is ever hurt, the doors of the Winthrop house are always open to her." I'd always thought of it as a nice sentiment, nothing more. "Dad left you more than a nice sentiment," Weston said. "He left you 15% of the company. Preston's managed it for you all these years, and it's time you started managing it yourself." His gaze sharpened. "And there's something else. Dad left us connections, standing, real power. All of it belongs to the whole family, not just to whoever it's aimed at. That's why Cole's case was never just your personal problem." His voice hardened, took on our father's old edge. "If someone comes after a Winthrop, they pay for it. Grant Whitfield's just the start. Cole's just the start. Everyone who looked the other way, everyone who took a bribe to help this happen, nobody walks away clean. The Winthrops are doing a full cleanup. No mercy." I leaned back against the seat and felt the last of the ice in my chest finally give way. My phone buzzed. A photo from Teddy's daycare teacher. Teddy at morning stretches, standing at the front of the line, seriously working his chubby little arms through the motions. A caption underneath. "Teddy was line leader today. He told me he's going to protect all the other kids. Protect the other kids." I zoomed in on his round cheeks and, for the first time in 3 days, smiled without having to work at it. On the 3rd day after Vanessa's arrest, word of it swept across the base like wildfire. People said the FBI had taken her out of her office in handcuffs, that she was tied to some sprawling international smuggling ring. I didn't follow the gossip. I spent my days with Teddy and let the lawyers handle the rest. Margot had already hired someone for me, a woman named Diane Hargrove, mid-40s, a divorce specialist with a reputation for never once losing a case in 15 years of practice. She reviewed my file, took off her reading glasses, and said, "Mrs. Winthrop, I've never seen a case this straightforward walk through my door. Your husband cheated, tried to move assets through a life insurance policy naming his mistress, and is currently under federal investigation. That policy alone guarantees you sole custody without a fight. And given the Whitfields' financial position, they have no leverage left to negotiate with at all. I don't just want custody," I told her. "I want everything. The house, the cars, the accounts. What's mine stays mine, and I don't want a single dollar of his, and I want my son's last name changed." She nodded and wrote it all down. "Consider it done." News kept trickling in from Weston. Grant's interviews were relentless, day after day. Counterintelligence had found 3 separate security assessments in Vanessa's program that had been crudely falsified. The kind of thing, Weston told me, that any junior auditor should have caught in 5 minutes, and Grant had signed off on all 3 without a second look. "He's not blind," Weston said over the phone one evening. "He just never bothered to read them. Told investigators he trusted her completely." Trusted. Coming from Weston's mouth, the word sounded like a cruel joke. He'd trusted her, and so he brought her onto a secure base. He'd trusted her, and so he handed her an $82 million contract. He'd trusted her, and so he signed page after page without reading a word of it. That trust was about to cost him his rank, his career, and very possibly his freedom. Vanessa's case moved with unusual speed once the Bureau took it over as a priority matter. She was looking at 15 to 18 years for espionage and unlawful export of restricted technology, a single working part in a much larger international smuggling operation, and she had chosen Grant, specifically, because she knew exactly how much residual feeling he still carried for her. From beginning to end, he had only ever been a key she needed to open a locked door, discarded the moment the door swung open. A week later, Diane Hargrove hand-delivered the divorce papers to Grant, who was confined to quarters pending. "Mommy's never going to let anyone turn you away from home again." He nodded seriously and whispered into my shoulder, "Mommy, don't cry." But I wasn't crying. I hadn't cried once since that day at the gate. A week after that, Grant signed the papers. Diane brought me the finalized agreement, his signature cramped and heavy-handed across every page. "He asked to see his son," she told me. "I explained that you have full custody, and visitation will be arranged separately going forward, and that, practically speaking, he can't see anyone right now regardless. As for the name change, that's finalized too. Weston's attorneys pushed it through faster than usual. Within a month, your son will officially be a Winthrop." "Good," I said. Chapter 14. When Vanessa's trial date was finally set, Eleanor Whitfield called me. Her voice sounded like sandpaper dragged across a rock. She begged me to go easier on Grant, for their son's sake. "Mrs. Whitfield," I said, "I didn't have him arrested. I didn't file the case against him. The federal government did that on its own. He led a woman onto a secure military installation who turned out to be running technology to a sanctioned foreign program. I didn't make him forge his own signature on those approvals." Silence on the line. "As for your husband's debt to Winthrop Holdings, that's a separate matter entirely. And a business one," I continued. "Even setting aside everything else, we'd have held Richard accountable for missing the covenant regardless." "You're heartless," she said, her voice breaking. "We were blind to ever let you into this family." "Mrs. Whitfield," I said, "your son was certainly blind. But he was never blind about me. He simply couldn't tell the difference between the people who actually loved him and the people who were using him. He's been blind for 4 straight years." I hung up and added her number to my block list. By the next morning, clips from the ceremony were already circulating. Someone's shaky cell phone footage of me walking down that aisle, the ring hitting the stage, Grant's face collapsing in real time. I didn't watch it. Margot sent me a screenshot of the view count anyway, unprompted, with a single line underneath. The internet has opinions, and they are not on his side. My phone didn't stop ringing that first day. Officers' wives I'd known for years, women from the spouses' coffee mornings I used to attend on base, called one after another, half of them fishing for details, the other half offering support that sounded suspiciously like relief, that it hadn't been their own husband caught out that way. I let most of the calls go to voicemail. There was exactly one person from that circle I called back, a woman named Patricia, whose husband had served under Grant for 2 years and who had never once, in all that time, pretended to like Vanessa Cole. I always thought there was something off about her, Patricia told me, the way she'd show up to things she had no reason to be at. I should have said something. It wouldn't have changed anything, I told her, and I meant it. Some things you can only understand from the inside, once they've already finished happening to you. Grant called 11 times over the next 2 days before his phone privileges were revoked entirely. I let every single call ring through to nothing. On the 12th attempt, I finally answered, only because I wanted to make sure he understood, one last time, that this wasn't a door he could keep knocking on. Charlotte. His voice was hoarse, stripped of all its usual command. Please, just let me explain. Let me see Teddy. You had 4 years to explain yourself, Grant. You used all of them lying to me about where you spent your evenings. I kept my voice even. There's nothing left for you to explain, and Teddy isn't a bargaining chip for you to use to get to me. I never meant for any of this. You never meant to get caught, I said. That's different from never meaning to do it. Don't call this number again. I hung up and, for the first time since the whole ordeal began, allowed myself to sit with an old memory instead of pushing it away. Our second wedding anniversary, a weekend at a lake house Weston had lent us, Grant grilling badly on a small charcoal grill, while Teddy, barely walking then, toddled after a dog that wasn't ours. Grant had burned the first round of burgers completely black and laughed about it, unself-conscious, easy, nothing like the stiff, composed commander in the auditorium. I had loved him once, without any qualifications attached to the feeling. That was the version of him I would let myself grieve, quietly, in private, exactly once. The version standing frozen on that stage, unable to produce a single honest word, was not a man I had any grief left over for. 2 weeks after the ceremony, Preston called a formal meeting at Winthrop Tower. Not the usual quarterly review, but something he described only as family business over the phone. I arrived to find the boardroom already occupied, Preston at the head of the table, Weston in his dress uniform straight from a meeting at the Pentagon, Margot with a folder of documents stacked neatly in front of her. Sit, Preston said, gesturing to the chair directly across from him, not the one at the far end where I usually sat during these things. I sat. Dad's agreement gave you 15% and full veto rights the day you turned 25, Preston said, sliding a document across the table. You've never once exercised them. I want you to look at this before you decide whether that changes today. The document was a proposed board resolution, full authorization for legal action against Whitfield Construction, asset seizure proceedings, and a formal termination of every remaining Winthrop contract connected to the family in any capacity. At the bottom, a line for my signature, right below Preston's and Weston's. You didn't need my signature for any of this, I said. You could have moved on all of it without me. We could have, Weston said. We didn't want to. Margot leaned forward. This isn't just corporate cleanup for us, Charlotte. This is about what happens to a Winthrop who gets hurt. Dad built this whole family around one idea, that we protect our own, completely, without asking permission first. But you're the one it happened to. If you want to pull back on any of it, say so now, and we stop. I looked around the table at the three of them, my brothers and my sister, all watching me with an expression I hadn't seen directed at me before. Not pity, not the careful gentleness people had been treating me with for 2 weeks. Something closer to respect. I picked up the pen and signed. Do all of it, I said. Don't stop at Whitfield Construction. Anyone who helped Vanessa Cole move money, anyone who signed off on a report they knew was falsified, anyone who took a bribe to look the other way, I want all of it documented and handed to the Bureau. Preston's mouth curved into that same cold, satisfied smile the men in my family all seemed to share. Now that, he said, sounds like our father's daughter. Grant's court-martial began in late July, a closed proceeding I wasn't permitted to attend, though Weston kept me informed through channels that were, strictly speaking, not meant to exist. The prosecution's case centered on the falsified security assessments, 3 separate documents, each one riddled with inconsistencies obvious enough that a first-year auditor could have flagged them in an afternoon, all 3 bearing Grant's approving signature without so much as a note in the margins. His defense attorney argued diminished culpability, that he'd been manipulated by someone he'd trusted since childhood, that the falsification itself had been sophisticated enough to fool people with far more technical training than a base commander typically had. The prosecution's answer was simple. A commanding officer doesn't get to outsource his judgment to affection. He was the one who signed. He was the one whose signature authorized $82 million in federal funds to flow toward a program that turned out to be feeding restricted technology to a sanctioned foreign interest. The tribunal took 11 days to reach its verdict. Grant was found guilty of dereliction of duty and negligent approval of a compromised contract. He was stripped of rank, dishonorably discharged, and denied any separation benefits after 16 years of otherwise unblemished service. Weston relayed the news to me over the phone in a tone that carried no satisfaction in it whatsoever, only the flat weight of fact. 16 years, he said. Gone in 11 days. Nobody even came to see him off the base. Not his aide, not a single officer he used to command. He walked out through a side gate with a duffel bag and got into a taxi by himself. I thought I might feel something when I heard that. Triumph, maybe, or at least some flicker of satisfaction. Instead, I felt almost nothing at all, which surprised me more than grief would have. And Cole? I asked. Her trial's scheduled for next month. The Bureau's confident. There isn't a version of this that ends with her walking free. Vanessa Cole's trial moved through the federal court system with the kind of speed reserved for cases the government wants very badly to be finished with. The evidence Preston's team had assembled, the falsified lab affiliations, the customs records, the intercepted communications with her overseas contacts, left her public defender with almost nothing to argue beyond mitigating circumstances. I wasn't in the courtroom for the verdict, but Margot was, and she called me the moment the jury foreman finished reading it out. 18 years, she said. Federal maximum security, full asset forfeiture. Her lawyers will appeal, obviously, but Preston says there's essentially no chance of it going anywhere. The Bureau built this one to be appeal-proof. 18 years. I turned the number over in my mind, trying to feel the size of it, and found that it didn't move me the way I'd expected. Not triumph, not vindication, just a kind of settling, the sense of a door finally closing all the way instead of hanging open on its hinges. How are you doing with all this? Margot asked, her voice softening in a way it rarely did. I'm fine, I told her, and for the first time in weeks, I actually believed it when I said it. Life, in the weeks that followed, took on a shape I hadn't experienced in years, quiet, orderly, entirely my own. I moved Teddy and myself into a townhouse 2 blocks from Margot's place, close enough that she could walk over for coffee most mornings, far enough from the base that I never had to drive past those gates by accident. I enrolled Teddy in a new preschool where nobody knew the name Whitfield yet, where he was just Teddy. A serious little boy who liked dinosaurs and insisted on being the line leader whenever the opportunity came up. I found, to my own quiet surprise, that I didn't miss the life I'd left behind nearly as much as I'd once assumed I would. I didn't miss the base housing, or the endless calendar of command functions I'd attended as Grant's dutiful +1, or the particular strain of performing a marriage for an audience of officers and their wives twice a month. What I missed, if I was honest with myself, was a version of Grant that I now understood had mostly existed in my own head, a man who was steady and kind, because I had needed him to be, not because he necessarily was. I started going into Winthrop Tower 2 or 3 days a week, at first just to sit in on Preston's meetings and understand what my 15% actually meant in practice, and then, gradually, to start asking questions of my own. Preston seemed almost amused by it at first, in the way an older brother is amused watching a younger sibling learn to ride a bike. The amusement faded fast once I started asking questions that made his analysts scramble for actual answers instead of reassurances. "You've got Dad's instincts," he told me one afternoon, watching me work through a due diligence report on a vendor he'd been considering cutting loose. He used to ask exactly this kind of question. Everyone thought he was being paranoid. He was usually right. "I'm not trying to run the company, Preston," I said. "I know you're not." He closed the folder in front of him. "That's exactly why I think you should have more of a say in it than you've been taking." By late summer, the corporate cleanup Weston had promised at the very beginning had extended well past Grant and the Whitfields. 2 junior officers who'd helped falsify inspection reports for Vanessa's project were quietly relieved of duty and referred for their own investigations. A base logistics contractor who'd taken kickbacks to look the other way on delivery discrepancies lost every Winthrop-adjacent contract in one afternoon. None of it made the news the way the ceremony had. These were quieter dismantlings, handled through legal filings and closed-door meetings rather than public spectacle. But each one landed with its own weight. I sat in on the board meeting where Preston formally proposed folding the Whitfield asset seizure into the corporation's broader restructuring plan. It was a technical meeting, full of language about liquidation timelines and receivership, but I understood, sitting there, that I was watching the last physical remnants of my marriage get itemized and priced out like inventory. "Any objection?" Preston asked, looking directly at me at the end of his presentation, out of genuine deference rather than formality. "None," I said. "Proceed exactly as planned." Afterward, walking me to the elevator, Weston fell into step beside me. "You never flinch anymore," he said. "You know that." Should I be flinching? No. He smiled, the real one, not the cold Winthrop smile he usually wore in boardrooms. "I just remember when you used to cry over a scraped knee for 20 minutes. Dad used to worry the world would eat you alive. And now? Now I think the world should be worried about you." He pressed the elevator button. "Dad would be relieved, honestly. He always said you were the one who felt everything the deepest. Turns out that just meant you'd fight the hardest, once you finally decided to." 3 months after the ceremony, the last cold snap of early autumn arrived, carrying the smell of wood smoke and fallen leaves, and I found myself driving out to my mother's estate in the countryside on a Saturday morning, Margot in the passenger seat, Teddy strapped into his booster in the back with a toy dinosaur clutched in one fist. "There's news," Margot said, scrolling through something on her phone. "Cole's final appeal was denied this morning. 18 years stands. Full asset forfeiture stays in place. Her legal team's out of options." 18 years. I turned the number over once more in my mind. the way I had every time it came up, and found the same quiet settling I'd felt the first time I heard the verdict. "And Grant?" I asked. "Officially finalized last week. Dishonorable discharge, no severance, no benefits after 16 years of service. Nobody from his unit even came to see him off the base. He left with a duffel bag and got in a cab by himself." I nodded slowly, eyes on the road. "Are you sad?" Margot asked, watching me carefully. "I'm not sad, Margot." My sister reached over and put her hand over mine on the gear shift. "I know," she said. "I just wanted to hear you say it." My mother was waiting on the porch when we pulled into the long gravel driveway, wrapped in a cardigan against the chill, and Teddy was out of the car and running toward her before I'd even fully parked. "Grandma! Grandma!" The house smelled like pot roast and baked apples the second we stepped inside, warm and thick enough to feel like a physical thing settling over my shoulders. While Teddy set up his building blocks in the living room, I slipped out to the backyard, where the old oak tree I used to climb as a girl still stood exactly where it always had, my father's wicker chair sitting beneath it, weathered gray now but intact. I sat down in the chair and tilted my face up toward the pale autumn sun. My phone buzzed against my leg. A message from Preston. "The board has formally approved the restructuring. Your 15% is now under your direct active management as of this morning. Documents are in your inbox. Welcome home, Charlotte Winthrop." A second message arrived a moment later, this one from Weston. "Order regarding Grant Whitfield has been distributed to every unit under the Corps. The Cole espionage case is officially closed. The Bureau formally thanked the Winthrop family for our cooperation. If Dad could see this, he'd be proud of you." I read that last line 3 times. Then I scrolled through my contacts, found Richard Whitfield's name, and typed out a short, final message. "Mr. Whitfield, per the agreement executed 3 years ago, Winthrop Holdings is initiating the seizure of your company's remaining assets, effective immediately. Please arrange for a full transfer of records within 30 days. Failure to comply will result in forced collection proceedings. Send." I set the phone down in my lap and closed my eyes, letting the wind move through the oak's branches above me. Footsteps crossed the grass behind me. "Mommy." Teddy climbed into my lap without waiting for an invitation, the way he always did, all sharp elbows and warm weight. "Grandma says it's almost time to eat." I wrapped both arms around him and pressed my chin to the top of his head. "Teddy," I said. "Starting today, your last name is Winthrop." He tilted his head back to look up at me, working through this with the same serious concentration he gave everything. "Is Mommy a Winthrop?" "Mommy's always been a Winthrop." "Is Grandma a Winthrop?" "And Uncle Weston, and Uncle Preston, and Aunt Margot." "All of us. The whole family." He considered this for another long moment, his small brow furrowed in thought, and then broke into a grin, 2 brand new front teeth on full display. "So we're all Winthrops," he announced, delighted, like he'd just solved something important. He wriggled down out of my lap and took off running toward the house, shouting the whole way. "Grandma, I'm a Winthrop now." I watched him go, laughing, wiping my eyes with the back of one hand, not from sadness this time. My phone buzzed once more in my pocket. An unfamiliar number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. "Charlotte, it's Vanessa. I'm writing from the facility. This is one of the numbers we're allowed. I know you'll never forgive me, and I'm not asking you to. I just wanted to say one thing. Donnie didn't know anything about the technology transfers. He trusted me completely, and I used that. He was a fool for it, but the fault is entirely mine. His only real mistake was ever meeting me." I listened to the whole message without saying a word, and when it ended, I deleted it. No. Grant Whitfield's mistake was never meeting Vanessa Cole. His mistake was carrying another woman in his heart the entire time he was married to me. His mistake was staying silent when his own family needed him to choose, clearly and without hesitation, who he actually belonged to. His mistake was ordering his own wife and son turned away from a gate because his old friend happened to be standing on the other side of it. Vanessa would never understand that distinction. Grant, honestly, might not either. But I no longer needed either of them to understand anything about me at all. When I walked back inside, the dining room table was already covered. Pot roast with carrots, a whole roasted chicken with baked apples, a bowl of mashed potatoes with a slick of melted butter pooling at the center. Margot was pouring wine. Preston and Weston stood by the window arguing amiably about something related to the corporation, but they both raised their glasses the second they saw me. "Welcome back, Charlotte Winthrop," Preston said. Weston smirked and pulled out the chair beside his own. "Sit here." Teddy was already working on a chicken leg, sauce smeared clean across his nose, entirely unbothered by the fact that 4 adults were toasting around him. This was my family. The whole, complicated, occasionally terrifying, entirely loyal shape of it. "Eat before it gets cold," my mother said, picking up her own fork. Margot set hers down again almost immediately. "By the way, Charlotte, Eleanor tried to reach me today. She wants visitation with Teddy." "And?" "I told her Teddy's a Winthrop now and has no legal relation to the Whitfield family. She's welcome to petition the court for a visitation schedule if she thinks that's worth pursuing." "Good call," Preston said, without looking up from his plate. Weston stayed quiet a moment, then glanced at me. "Should we push back harder on any of it? There's more we could do." I shook my head. "No. Enough. Grant's lost his rank, his career, his family, and his son. He went from a commander with a real future in front of him to a man discharged in disgrace with a duffel bag and a cab fare. That's enough consequence to fill up the rest of anyone's life. We don't need to add to it." Lunch stretched on past 2 in the afternoon. My brothers left first, Weston pausing at the gate on his way out to the driveway. "Dad told me something once, before he died," he said. "Out of all of us, he worried about you the most. You were the youngest. He was scared you'd get hurt someday, and he wasn't sure you'd know how to fight back if it happened." He looked at me, something gentler than his usual expression settling over his face. "I think he can rest easy now." He climbed into his dark green SUV, the engine turning over with a low, steady purr, and the car disappeared around the bend in the driveway. Margot came out onto the porch a few minutes later, arms crossed against the chill. "Come back inside, it's getting cold." "Thank you, Margot." I meant it for more than the reminder about the cold. She ruffled my hair, the way she'd done since we were kids. "Don't mention it. Go on." I lingered a moment longer, looking up at the sky. High, clear, and blue in the particular way autumn afternoons sometimes are, right before the light starts to fade early. My phone buzzed one more time in my coat pocket. A notification from the bank. A dividend deposit from Winthrop Holdings, the amount larger than I'd ever bothered noticing before. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and went inside. The living room glowed warm and yellow in the late afternoon light. Teddy had moved on to a new toy dinosaur and ran over laughing the moment he saw me. Margot settled onto the couch with her wine, already halfway into some story that had my mother laughing from the kitchen doorway. Outside the window, past the fading afternoon light, the old oak tree stood exactly where it always had. Its roots sunk deep and permanent into the ground beneath it, holding steady against whatever weather came. The same way, I understood now, my family always would. I had spent 4 years believing that the only way to build a life was to attach myself, completely, to someone else's. His career, his family, his version of what our marriage should look like. It had taken one afternoon at a guarded gate in 98-degree heat to teach me the difference between being needed and being valued, and it had taken 3 months after that to build something sturdier out of the wreckage than what I'd lost. I sat down at the table, pulled Teddy into my lap despite his half-hearted protest that he was getting too big for that now, and let my family's noise fill the room around me. Preston's laugh from somewhere near the kitchen, Margot's teasing, my mother humming something old and half-remembered as she moved between the stove and the table. Whatever else had ended that summer, this, at least, had never once been in question. I didn't expect to see Grant again after the divorce was finalized, and for a long while I told myself I didn't want to. But 6 weeks after his discharge came through, Diane Hargrove called to tell me he'd requested, through his attorney, a single supervised meeting to say goodbye to Teddy before he left the state for good. He had family in Ohio, a cousin willing to put him up while he figured out what a life without a uniform even looked like. "You're under no obligation," Diane told me. "Legally, this is entirely your call." I thought about it for 2 days before I said yes, not for Grant's sake, but because some part of me believed Teddy deserved the chance to say a real goodbye instead of simply watching his father disappear from his life without explanation. We met at a public park, neutral ground, Diane standing a discreet distance away with her arms crossed. Grant looked different than he had on that stage. Thinner. Older somehow, though it had only been a few months. He'd traded the pressed uniform for a plain gray jacket that didn't fit him quite right, the kind of thing a man buys off a rack in a hurry because he no longer has anyone helping him choose his clothes. "Thank you for this," he said quietly, not quite meeting my eyes. "Don't thank me. Thank Teddy. This is for him, not for you." He crouched down to Teddy's level, and for a moment his composure nearly broke entirely. I watched him swallow hard, twice, before he managed to get any words out. "Hey, buddy, I'm gonna be living somewhere else for a while, but I want you to know your dad loves you. That part was never a lie, whatever else happened." Teddy studied him with the plain, unfiltered honesty only small children are capable of. "Mommy says you made her cry." Grant's jaw tightened. "I did. I'm sorry for that. I'm going to spend a long time being sorry for that." "Okay," Teddy said, apparently satisfied with the apology in the straightforward way children often are, and then, without any further ceremony, turned and ran off toward the swing set, already finished with the conversation. Grant watched him go, then looked up at me from where he still crouched on the grass. "I know I don't get to ask you for anything anymore, but for whatever it's worth, I am sorry, Charlotte. Not because I got caught, because of what I did to you, and to him." "I believe that you're sorry now," I said. "I don't think you'd have ever gotten there without getting caught. That's the part I can't get past." He didn't argue. There was nothing left in him, I think, to argue with. "Take care of yourself, Grant," I said, and meant it as plainly as I could manage, not warmly, but not cruelly either. Just as a fact, offered and closed. I turned and walked toward the swings, where Teddy was already shouting for me to push him higher, and I didn't look back to watch Grant leave the park. Diane told me afterward that he'd sat on the bench a long while after we left, alone, before he finally stood up and walked away. 1 year passed the way years do once you stop marking time by someone else's schedule, faster than you expect, and somehow also more fully lived than the years before it. Teddy started kindergarten that fall, backpack nearly as big as he was, and came home the first week with a new best friend named Oliver and strong opinions about which cafeteria days had the good chicken nuggets. I took a formal seat on Winthrop Holdings' board that same year, not as a courtesy appointment the way Preston had once quietly assumed I'd want, but as an active voting member who read every report in full before every meeting. Preston stopped introducing me to new hires as "our sister" and started introducing me, correctly, by my title. Weston sent me a bottle of good scotch the day the board formally approved my seat, with a note that read simply, "About time." Vanessa's appeal was denied a second time that spring, closing off her last realistic avenue for early release. I heard about it from Margot in a two-line text, and felt, by then, almost nothing at all. Not satisfaction, not lingering anger, just the flat acknowledgement of a matter fully and permanently resolved. Grant, as far as I knew, had settled somewhere outside Columbus, working in his cousin's landscaping business. Eleanor Whitfield still tried Margot's number occasionally and was still redirected, politely and firmly, to the family's attorney every time. Richard Whitfield's company had been fully absorbed into Winthrop Holdings' restructuring division 8 months after the seizure notice, its assets liquidated at exactly the terms the covenant had specified, no more and no less. I found, somewhere in that year, that I had stopped thinking of any of it as unfinished business. It had simply become the shape of what had happened, filed away the way you file away any other significant event in a life, not forgotten, not still raw, just settled into its proper place in the timeline. On the 1-year anniversary of the ceremony, though I hadn't marked the date on any calendar, and only realized it had passed when Margot mentioned it over dinner, I drove out to the family estate on a whim, alone this time, Teddy staying the weekend with his grandmother already, and sat in my father's old wicker chair beneath the oak tree as the afternoon light slanted gold through the branches. I thought about the woman who had knelt at a guarded gate a year earlier, covering her son's ears with trembling hands, and understood that I barely recognized her anymore. Not because I'd become someone harder, exactly, though I had, in ways I didn't regret. Mostly because I'd finally stopped mistaking devotion for identity. I had spent 4 years defining myself entirely through what I gave to a marriage that had never, as it turned out, been built to hold the weight of it. My phone buzzed. A photo from Teddy's grandmother. Teddy in the backyard, upside down on the tire swing, laughing so hard his whole face had scrunched shut. I smiled at it the way I smiled at most things now, easily, without effort, and typed back a single word. Perfect. The wind moved through the oak's branches above me, the same wind that had probably moved through them the year my father sat in this exact chair and decided, without telling anyone, to leave his youngest daughter 15% of everything he'd built, and one quiet line in his will that I hadn't understood until I needed it. If Charlotte is ever hurt, the doors of the Winthrop house are always open to her. He had known, somehow, long before I did, that the day might come when I would need somewhere solid to stand. He simply hadn't lived long enough to see that when it finally came, I wouldn't just walk through those open doors looking for shelter. I would walk through them, and keep walking, until I'd built something of my own steady enough to stand on either side of. I ran into the young soldier from the gate almost by accident, nearly a year and a half after that first afternoon, at a diner off the highway near where I'd taken Teddy for a dentist appointment. He was out of uniform, in a plain flannel and jeans, and it took me a moment to place him. The same face, older somehow, no longer stretched tight with the particular anxiety of a boy following orders he clearly hadn't wanted to give. He recognized me first. He set down his coffee and, after a visible internal debate, walked over to my table. "Mrs. I'm sorry, I don't know what to call you now," he said. "I wanted to say something to you, if that's all right. I've thought about that day a lot." "It's Miss Winthrop now," I told him. "And you can sit, if you want." He sat, awkwardly, hands wrapped around his coffee cup like he needed something to hold on to. "I got out about 6 months after everything happened. Wasn't really the same on base after Colonel Whitfield was gone. Figured it was a good time to try something else." He hesitated. "I felt sick about it for a long time. What I said to you that day? I knew, standing there, that it wasn't right. I just didn't know what else to do with an order like that." You were 20 years old and somebody with 3 ranks on you told you what to say, I said. I was never angry at you. I want you to know that. I was angry at the man who put you in that position in the first place. Something in his shoulders loosened, like he'd been carrying that particular weight around for a year and a half without anywhere to set it down. Thank you for saying that. I've thought about your little boy a lot too. How old is he now? 6. Starting first grade this fall. Give him my best, the young man said, and then, standing to go, added almost shyly, for what it's worth, ma'am. The way you handled all of it. A lot of guys on base talked about it for months. Not in a bad way. More like they were glad somebody finally did something instead of just letting it happen quietly, the way that stuff usually gets handled. I thought about that exchange for the rest of the drive home. The strange, small comfort of learning that the story hadn't only lived on as gossip and cell phone footage, but as something closer to a genuine reckoning for at least a few of the people who'd witnessed it up close. My father built Winthrop Holdings up from a single regional construction firm his own father had left him, a modest thing with maybe 40 employees when he took it over at 26. By the time he died, it spanned construction, logistics, and a diversified investment arm that touched half the infrastructure projects on the East Coast in one form or another. He used to say at the dinner table that he'd built the whole thing on exactly one rule: take care of your own people, and never, under any circumstance, let anyone mistake generosity for weakness. I hadn't understood growing up how literally he meant that second half. I'd assumed, the way children usually do, that the softer, gentler version of him I saw at home, the one who read to me at bedtime and cried, unashamed, at my 8th grade graduation, was simply a different person from the one who ran board meetings and negotiated contracts. It took me 31 years and one ruined thermos of soup to understand they'd been the exact same man the entire time. He had simply never needed to show me the second half, because nobody had ever tried to hurt one of his children while he was alive to stop it. Weston liked to say our father would have handled the entire Whitfield situation in half the time it took me, with twice the ruthlessness and none of the hesitation I'd allowed myself in that first week. I didn't disagree with him, exactly. But I also understood, by the end of it, that the hesitation hadn't been weakness. It had been the last few days of a woman still trying to believe the best about a person she'd loved, before she finally let that belief go for good and did what needed to be done instead. My father, I think, would have understood that particular difference better than anyone gave him credit for. He'd married my mother, after all, the same year he nearly lost the company to a partner who tried to force him out in a hostile buyout. And by every account I'd ever heard, he'd spent a full month trying to talk that partner into doing right by the company before he finally, and completely, destroyed the man's position in the industry instead. Mercy first, and only when mercy failed, everything else. I like to think I'd inherited that order of operations from him, even if it had taken me most of a lifetime to recognize it as a strength instead of a flaw. Preston asked me once, almost a year into my active board seat, whether I'd ever consider remarrying. It wasn't really a question so much as an opening, the kind older siblings offer when they're worried you've decided to close a door permanently, rather than simply leaving it shut for a while. I'm not opposed to it someday, I told him honestly. I'm just not in any hurry to find out. I had by then built something I hadn't expected to build. A life that didn't require anyone else's presence to feel complete. Teddy and I had our own rhythms: pancakes on Saturday mornings, a standing dinner with Margot every Wednesday, a running joke between us about which of my brothers would show up unannounced with an inappropriately extravagant gift for no particular occasion. I went to board meetings and read every report front to back. I took Teddy to his soccer games and stood on the sideline with the other parents, none of whom had any idea what my last name meant, beyond being the mother of a very serious 6-year-old goalkeeper. I wasn't lonely, exactly, though I understood that from the outside, it might have looked that way to people who assumed a woman needed a partner to consider her life finished. What I had instead was something steadier than most of the marriages I'd watched up close over the years, a family that showed up without being asked, siblings who'd proven, in the space of a single terrible summer, that their loyalty had never once been conditional on anything I did or didn't do to earn it. If someone came along someday who understood that kind of loyalty, who could stand inside it instead of resenting it or trying to compete with it, I imagined I'd know. In the meantime, I had exactly what I needed, and for the first time in longer than I could easily remember, I wasn't waiting for anything else to complete it. 2 years to the month after that first afternoon at the gate, I drove past Fort Callahan for the first time since the ceremony. Not through the gates themselves, but along the perimeter road that ran past the fence line, on my way to a groundbreaking for an unrelated Winthrop project a few miles further out. I hadn't planned the route that way on purpose. It was simply the fastest way to get where I was going, and I found, pulling up to the light at the main intersection across from the entrance, that I could look directly at the guard booth without my chest tightening the way it once might have. New soldiers manned the checkpoint now, faces I didn't recognize, waving cars through the visitor lane with the same brisk efficiency I remembered from my own years driving through. None of them knew who I was. None of them had any reason to. Whatever story had once played out at that exact spot had long since become old base gossip, the kind that gets repeated a few times by people who weren't actually there, and then fades entirely once enough new faces cycle through. I sat at the red light for the length of one full cycle, looking at that gate, and felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not grief, not anger, not even the cold satisfaction I'd carried around for the better part of a year after the divorce. Just a kind of distant, settled recognition, the way you might look at the house you grew up in after you've long since moved away and built an entirely different life somewhere else. It had mattered enormously once. It didn't anymore. Not in any way that touched the actual shape of my days. The light turned green. I drove on without looking back in the mirror, and by the time I reached the groundbreaking site 20 minutes later, I'd stopped thinking about the gate entirely, already turning over the logistics of the ribbon-cutting ceremony in my head instead, which, I noted with some private amusement, was exactly the kind of formal military-adjacent event I'd once attended purely as somebody's wife, and now attended as the person whose signature had authorized the funding. Teddy turned 7 that winter, and for his birthday, he asked, with the specific, unshakable certainty of a 7-year-old who has been thinking about something for weeks, for a dog. Not any dog. A dog, he specified, exactly like the one in the family portrait he'd drawn back when he was 4, the one that had stood in for the father he'd decided, on his own, not to include in the picture. I hadn't remembered that detail until he brought it up, and something about hearing him reference it so casually, so entirely without the weight it had once carried, told me more about how far we'd both come than any of the corporate victories or courtroom verdicts ever had. To him, by then, it wasn't a wound. It was just a fact about his early childhood, filed away the same way any other kid files away the year they lost a first tooth or learned to ride a bike. We got the dog, a scruffy, good-natured mutt from a shelter 2 towns over, whom Teddy named Biscuit after approximately 4 minutes of serious deliberation, and I watched my son fall instantly, completely in love in the particular unguarded way only children and dogs seem able to manage with each other. Margot came by that weekend and sat on my kitchen floor letting Biscuit lick her hands while Teddy narrated, at great length, everything the dog had done that day. "You know," Margot said, once Teddy had run off to find Biscuit's leash for a walk he'd already announced twice, "I don't think I've seen you this settled since before you married Grant in the first place." "I don't think I've felt this settled since before I married Grant in the first place," I told her, and meant it entirely. She reached over and squeezed my hand, the same gesture she'd used on the drive out to the estate that autumn 2 years before. And neither of us said anything else about it, because there wasn't really anything else that needed saying. That Christmas, the whole family gathered at the estate the way we did every year now. Preston and his wife, Weston flying in between deployments, Margot bringing an absurd number of gifts that she insisted were all for Teddy, but somehow always included at least one thing for me as well. My mother presiding over the kitchen with the same quiet, competent warmth she'd always had. Teddy tore through his presents with Biscuit underfoot the entire time, and by early afternoon the whole house smelled like cinnamon and roasting turkey and the particular chaos of a family that had, by then, fully closed the door on the worst year any of us had lived through and moved on into something sturdier on the other side of it. I stepped out onto the back porch for a moment during the lull between dinner and dessert, coat pulled tight against the cold, and looked out at the oak tree standing bare and dark against the winter sky. Its branches stripped clean, but its trunk as solid as it had ever been. My father's wicker chair sat beneath it, dusted lightly with snow. I thought about the woman who had knelt at a guarded gate 2.5 years earlier, palms pressed over her son's ears, and understood, with the particular clarity that only comes with real distance, that I didn't just no longer recognize her. I actively didn't want to be her again. Not because she'd done anything wrong in that moment, but because she'd spent 4 years believing her own worth was measured entirely by how much of herself she could hand over to someone else's life. The version of me standing on that porch now measured herself by an entirely different accounting. By a son who ran a household full of grown adults like his own personal kingdom, and never once doubted for a single day that he was loved without condition. By a family that had proven, in the worst week of my life, that their loyalty had never once needed to be earned in the first place. It had simply always been there, waiting for the day I needed to lean on it. By a company, a legacy, a name that I now understood I'd been handed not as a fallback plan, but as the actual foundation my father had built specifically so that none of his children would ever have to stand alone against anyone who tried to hurt them. The back door opened behind me. Teddy stuck his head out, Biscuit wedged under one arm despite the dog clearly being too big by then to be carried that way. "Mommy, Uncle Weston says it's time for pie." "I'm coming, baby." I took one last look at the oak tree, its roots running deep and unshaken beneath the frozen ground, and went back inside to the warm, loud, entirely unbreakable center of everything I actually needed. The following spring, Winthrop Holdings closed on the largest infrastructure contract in the company's history, a multi-state logistics expansion that Preston had been quietly negotiating for the better part of 2 years. I sat in on the final signing, not as an observer this time, but as one of 3 signatories on the corporate side, my name printed in full beneath Preston's and Weston's on every page of the agreement. Afterward, in the elevator down from the executive floor, Preston turned to me with an expression I hadn't seen on him before, something close to genuine surprise at his own realization. "You know," he said, "3 years ago I would have handled this whole deal without even telling you it existed. I'd have signed off on your behalf and mentioned it at Christmas, if I remembered to at all." "I know," I said. "I didn't mind back then. You'd mind now." "I'd absolutely mind now." He laughed, short and genuine, nothing like the cold boardroom smile he usually wore. "Dad used to say the measure of a good business isn't how it treats you when things are easy. It's what happens the one time everything falls apart at once. I think about that a lot, watching you these past few years." He glanced sideways at me as the elevator doors opened onto the lobby. "You didn't just survive the worst thing that ever happened to you, Charlotte. You came out the other side running half the company. That's not the same thing as recovering. That's an entirely different outcome." I thought about that assessment for the rest of the drive home, turning it over the way I turned over most things now. Carefully, without letting it become either more or less significant than it actually was. He wasn't wrong, but I also understood, better than my brother ever fully could, that the difference between simply recovering and building something new out of the wreckage hadn't been a matter of ambition or even resilience in the way people usually meant those words. It had been a matter of finally understanding, at 31 years old, standing at a gate in the blistering heat, with my son's small hands pressed under my own, that nobody was ever coming to hand me my worth on a platter. I'd had to build the platform myself, out of exactly the materials my father had left lying around for me the whole time, waiting for the day I'd finally need them. Teddy asked me, not long after his 8th birthday, why we didn't have a father in the house the way some of his friends did. It wasn't an accusatory question, or even a particularly sad one, more the plain, matter-of-fact curiosity of a kid cataloging the differences between his own life and the lives of the people around him. I sat with him on the back steps, Biscuit sprawled across both our feet in the late afternoon sun, and thought carefully about how to answer. Some families have 2 parents in the house, I said. Some families have 1. Some kids have a mom and a dad who don't live together, or 2 moms, or 2 dads, or a grandma who raises them instead. There isn't really one right way for a family to look. What matters is whether everybody in it takes care of each other. But you and Daddy used to live together. We did. And then we didn't. Because Daddy made some choices that meant it wasn't good for either of us to keep living that way. That's not something you did, or something wrong with you. Sometimes grown-ups make choices that break something that can't get fixed again, even when everybody wishes it could. Teddy considered this with his usual gravity, scratching behind Biscuit's ear. Are you sad about it? Not anymore, I told him, honestly. I was, for a little while. Now I mostly just feel lucky. I've got you, and Grandma, and Uncle Preston, and Uncle Weston, and Aunt Margot, and Biscuit. That's a pretty full house, even without a dad living in it. He nodded slowly, apparently satisfied, and went back to scratching the dog's ears without any further questions, the way children do once they've gotten the honest answer they were actually looking for. I sat there a while longer after he'd wandered off to find his soccer ball, watching the light change over the yard, and thought, not for the first time, that the truest measure of everything I'd fought for in that first terrible summer wasn't the size of the settlement, or the length of anyone's prison sentence, or even the seat on the board. It was a boy who could ask a hard question about his own family and receive in return an answer steady enough that he didn't feel the need to ask it again. On what would have been my father's 70th birthday, the whole family gathered at the estate one more time, a tradition we'd kept up every year since his death, regardless of how far any of us had scattered in the meantime. We ate dinner at the same long table, told the same worn, comfortable stories about him that had long since smoothed into something closer to family scripture than memory, and afterward I walked out to the oak tree alone, the way I always did on that particular night, and sat in his old chair beneath the bare spring branches. I did what you asked, Dad, I said quietly, to no one, the way I had every year since that first terrible summer. I didn't let anyone humiliate a Winthrop daughter and walk away clean. I built something out of it too, not just the revenge, though I know you'd have appreciated that part. Something steadier. A whole life, actually, that doesn't depend on anybody else's permission to exist. The wind moved through the branches above me, the same wind, I like to think, that had rustled through them the year he'd quietly signed over 15% of everything he'd built to a daughter who, at the time, had no idea what to do with it beyond depositing the dividend checks without looking at the total. I understood now, 4 years past the worst afternoon of my life, exactly what that 15% had always actually been. Not an inheritance, not a safety net, not even, really, a business asset in the way Preston and Weston had always discussed it in board meetings. It had been my father's version of the one line he'd left for me in his will, a promise, made years before I ever needed it, that the doors of the Winthrop house would always be open, and that behind those doors, I would always find exactly the tools I needed to build my own way back out into the world, on my own terms, answerable to absolutely no one but myself. I sat beneath the oak a while longer, until the cold finally drove me back inside toward the noise and warmth of my family, my son already fast asleep on the living room couch with Biscuit curled against his side, and understood, with the same settled, unshakable clarity I'd carried with me ever since that summer, that whatever else life eventually asked of me, I would never again mistake being loved for being owned, and I would never again wait at a gate for permission to walk through a door that had, all along, belonged to me. I hadn't let myself think much, in all the chaos of that first summer, about the day I found out I was pregnant with Teddy. But it came back to me unbidden one evening, years later, while I was helping him with a school project about family history, and I found myself telling him a version of it softened just enough for an 8-year-old to hear. I'd taken the test alone in a gas station bathroom on the way back from visiting Grant on base, too nervous to wait until I got home, and then sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes just staring at the two lines, equal parts terrified and elated. When I told Grant that night, he'd gone completely silent for a long moment, and I remembered genuinely worrying, in that silence, that I'd made some enormous mistake bringing a child into a marriage he wasn't ready for. Then he'd crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and lifted me clean off the floor, laughing, saying my name over and over like it was the only word he had left. I told Teddy the laughing part, and the lifting off the floor part, because those parts were true and good, and deserved to survive whatever came after them. I left out the part where, 4 years later, I would understand that the same man capable of that kind of unguarded joy had also been capable of writing another woman's name on a life insurance policy without once imagining what it would do to the child he'd been so overjoyed to learn about. Some contradictions, I'd come to understand, simply exist inside people without ever fully resolving. Grant had loved his son. I believed that completely, and had never once doubted it, even at the height of everything else. He had simply also been a man weak enough to let an old feeling for someone else quietly rot the foundation out from under everything he claimed to value more. Both things were true at once, and neither one canceled the other out. I'd stopped needing them to, somewhere along the way. Preston once walked me through, in far more detail than I'd originally asked for, exactly how the FBI's Economic Crimes Unit had first been tipped off to the irregularities in Vanessa's contract, a conversation that happened almost 2 years after the fact, over coffee in his office, when I finally asked him the full mechanics of it out of simple curiosity rather than any lingering need for closure. It wasn't just the paper trail we handed them, he told me. Weston's contact at Army CY had already flagged some of the technology transfer patterns independently, months before any of this happened with you and Grant. What we gave them was the missing piece, a clear motive and a clear channel. Cole's operation had been running under the radar for over a year because nobody had connected her personal relationship with Grant to the contract approvals. The second we handed over the insurance policy and the recording, everything else fell into place for them almost immediately. So even without me, they'd have caught her eventually. Eventually, Preston agreed. Maybe another year, maybe 2. And by then, who knows what else she'd have moved through that pipeline. What you gave them was speed. And Grant's negligence, once it was documented clearly enough, meant the case against her was airtight instead of merely strong. He studied me for a moment. Do you regret any of it? Knowing now how much of it was already in motion regardless of what you did? No, I said, without having to think about it. I didn't do any of it to be the one who caught her. I did it because I refused to keep standing at a gate waiting for someone to decide whether I deserved to walk through it. Whatever else came out of that, including catching a spy who was already going to get caught eventually, wasn't really the point for me. It was just what happened to be true once I stopped waiting. Preston nodded slowly and didn't say anything else about it. And I understood, watching him, that this was as close as my oldest brother ever came to telling someone he was proud of them without using the actual words. I think about that first afternoon at the gate more rarely now than I once thought I would, not because I've forgotten it, but because it no longer occupies the central place in my life it once did. It has become, instead, simply the hinge on which an entire life turned, the exact point where one version of myself ended and a considerably sturdier one began. I still make chicken and wild rice soup sometimes, on cold evenings, though I've never once poured it into that particular steel thermos again. It sits in a box somewhere in my mother's basement along with a handful of other things from that marriage I never got rid of, but also never wanted in daily view, not out of sentiment, but simply because throwing them away felt like giving the memory more weight than it deserved either way. Some things you don't need to destroy. You just need to stop letting them decide anything about your life. Teddy is 9 now, taller every time I turn around, still fiercely loyal to Biscuit and increasingly opinionated about everything from soccer strategy to what constitutes an acceptable amount of vegetables on a dinner plate. He knows the broad outline of what happened when he was 4, filtered through age-appropriate honesty rather than the raw specifics, that his father made choices that hurt our family, that those choices had consequences, that none of it was ever his fault to carry. He carries himself most days like a boy who has never once doubted that he is loved completely and without condition, which is, in the end, the only outcome from that entire summer that ever actually mattered to me. The rest of it, the $78 million, the 18 years, the dishonorable discharge, the name on the insurance policy, the recording, the ring on the stage. All of that was simply the mechanism. The real inheritance, the thing my father actually left me buried inside 15% of a company and one quiet line in a will, was the certainty that I never again had to wait at anyone's gate to find out whether I belonged somewhere. I had built the belonging myself, out of exactly the materials he'd left waiting for me, and I intended to keep building it, for as long as I had breath left to do it with. Margot asked me once during one of our standing Wednesday dinners whether I thought I'd have found my way to the same place eventually, even without that specific afternoon at the gate. Whether some other betrayal, some other slower unraveling, would have pushed me toward the same reckoning if Grant had simply been more careful about hiding things rather than more foolish about who he trusted. I turned the question over for a long time before I answered her, because it wasn't one I'd let myself sit with before. I don't think so, I told her finally. I think I'd have kept telling myself smaller and smaller stories to explain the smaller and smaller pieces of him that didn't add up, the way I already had been for months without fully admitting it to myself. The gate was the first thing loud enough that I couldn't talk myself back down from it. If he'd been more careful, I might have spent another 5 years doing exactly that. That's a hard thing to say out loud. It's a true thing, I said. I loved being married to the idea of him more than I let myself notice how little of the actual man matched that idea, toward the end. I'm not proud of that. I've just made my peace with it, the same way I've made my peace with everything else that happened that summer. Margot reached across the table and refilled my wine without being asked, the small, unspoken gesture she'd always used in place of saying something more directly comforting. For what it's worth, she said, I don't think there's any shame in needing something loud enough to finally wake you up. Most people never get that. They just keep living inside the smaller and smaller story until it swallows the rest of their life whole. I thought about all the women I'd known over the years who had stayed inside exactly that kind of shrinking story. Officers' wives, mostly, people I'd sat across from at coffee mornings and command functions, women who had quietly rearranged their entire sense of self around husbands who gave them less and less reason to. I didn't judge any of them for it. I understood, better than I once would have, how easy it is to mistake the absence of an obvious, undeniable betrayal for the presence of an actual, functioning marriage. What had saved me, in the end, wasn't virtue or foresight. It was luck, mostly. The accident of having a family with the resources and the will to move fast and completely the moment I finally asked them to, and the small mercy of a betrayal loud enough that I couldn't talk myself out of seeing it clearly. Not everyone gets both of those things at once. I never forgot, in all the years afterward, how much of my own rescue had depended on circumstances entirely outside my control, and it kept me, I think, considerably gentler toward other people's slower, quieter unravelings than I might otherwise have been. The last time I spoke to Eleanor Whitfield was almost 3 years after the divorce, an unexpected call that came through on a number I no longer had blocked, since Margot had eventually cleared out my old contact restrictions during a phone upgrade, and nobody had thought to re-add that one. Her voice sounded older than it had any right to, given how little time had actually passed. "Charlotte, I know I have no right to call you. I just wanted to tell you that Richard passed away last month. His heart. I thought you'd want to know for Teddy's sake, in case he ever asks about that side of the family someday." I sat with the news for a moment, surprised by the small, genuine pang of sorrow that moved through me. Not for the man who had begged me in a marble lobby to spare a company that had never once thought of me as anything but an asset to be managed, but for the fact that any death, even one belonging to a man I had every reason to feel nothing for, still registered somewhere as a real and finished thing. "I'm sorry for your loss, Eleanor," I said, and meant it. In the narrow, human way you can mean something like that, even for people who hurt you badly. "Thank you." A pause. "Grant came back for the funeral. He's doing better, I think. Working steadily. He asked about Teddy. I told him I didn't think that was my place to answer for you." "It isn't," I agreed, gently. "But you can tell him Teddy's doing well. He's happy. He plays soccer. He has a dog he's completely obsessed with, and he's got more family around him than most kids know what to do with. If Grant wants more than that, he knows exactly how to reach my attorney." "That's more than I expected you to offer," Eleanor said quietly. "It's not for Grant's sake," I told her. "It's because Teddy deserves to know, someday if he asks, that I never tried to erase his father from existence out of spite. I just never let his father's mistakes become mine to keep carrying." I paused. "Take care of yourself, Eleanor." I hung up and sat with the phone in my lap for a long while afterward, feeling, for the first time in years, something close to a complete and total closing of that particular chapter. Not forgiveness exactly, but something quieter and more final than anger. The last loose thread of an old life, tied off and set down for good. People sometimes ask me, when they learn the outline of what happened that summer, whether I ever wonder how things would have gone if Grant had simply been honest with me from the start, if he'd come home one evening and told me plainly that his old feelings for Vanessa had resurfaced, instead of letting me find out at a guarded gate with our son's hand in mine. I understand why people ask. It's a more comfortable question than the one underneath it, which is really whether I think I could have forgiven him if he had. I don't know the answer, and I've stopped pretending I do. Honesty delivered before the damage is done is a different animal entirely from honesty forced out of someone after they've already been caught, and I like to think I would have respected the first kind, even if it broke my heart just as badly. But Grant never gave me the chance to find out which version of myself would have shown up for that conversation, and in the end, I've decided it doesn't matter which one it would have been. He chose the version of events where I found out on my knees at a checkpoint, covering my son's ears with shaking hands, and that choice was entirely his to make and entirely his to answer for. What I know for certain is this: the woman who knelt at that gate in the summer heat, and the woman who sat in a courtroom gallery watching a jury foreman read out an 18-year sentence, and the woman who now sits on her back porch some evenings watching her son chase a dog across a yard that belongs entirely to the two of them, are not three different people. They are the same woman, at three different points along the same unbroken line, each one built directly out of the one before it. My father used to say that the true measure of a family isn't how it behaves when everything is easy. It's what happens the one time everything falls apart at once, and whether the people standing closest to you show up with their sleeves already rolled up or with excuses already prepared. I got my answer to that question in the space of about 72 hours, 3 years ago, and I have never once needed to ask it again. The oak tree in my mother's backyard is still standing, same as it always has been, its roots running deeper into that ground with every year that passes, entirely unbothered by whatever weather moves through its branches. I think about it more than I probably should, as a kind of private shorthand for everything I actually learned that summer. Storms come. Some of them come without warning, in the middle of what looks, from the outside, like an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. What matters isn't whether you can prevent the storm from arriving, it's whether your roots go down deep enough, into ground solid enough, that you're still standing once it passes. Mine did. I intend to make sure my sons do too, for as long as I'm the one responsible for teaching him how. Sometimes, late at night after Teddy's asleep, and the house has gone quiet except for the soft sound of Biscuit snoring from his spot at the foot of the stairs, I take out the old stock transfer agreement my father signed all those years ago and read that one clause again, the one about veto rights. The one I read 100 times that first terrible week, without ever quite believing it applied to me the way it turned out to. I don't need to read it anymore. Not really. I know every word of it by heart, the way I know the exact weight of my son's head against my shoulder, or the exact sound my heels make against pavement when I've decided, once and for all, that I'm done asking anyone's permission for anything. But I keep the document anyway, folded into the same drawer where it's lived since before I was married, because some objects earn a permanent place in a life not for what they say on paper, but for what they taught you the day you finally understood what they meant. My father wrote 15% and one quiet sentence into a will, years before he could have known exactly which storm his youngest daughter would eventually have to weather. He couldn't have predicted Grant or Vanessa, or a guard booth in the 98-degree heat, or a son old enough to ask hard questions and young enough to still trust every answer I gave him. What he understood instead was something simpler and more durable than any single prediction could have been. That the people he loved most would eventually need somewhere solid to stand, and that it was his job, even from beyond the reach of his own lifetime, to make sure that ground was there waiting when the day finally came. It came for me on an ordinary summer morning, at a gate I'd walked through 100 times without ever once questioning whether it was truly open to me. It won't look the same for anyone else. It eventually comes for. Not for Teddy. Not for whoever he grows up to love. Not for anyone reading this who recognizes some smaller, quieter version of that same afternoon somewhere in their own life. But I believe, with the same settled certainty I've carried with me every day since, that the ground is there for all of us, waiting, the moment we finally stop kneeling at someone else's gate and start building on our own. I think of that gate now, when I think of it at all, not as the place where my marriage ended, but as the exact spot where I stopped waiting to be let in anywhere and started building doors of my own instead. That, in the end, is the only inheritance I ever actually needed, and the only one I intend to leave behind when it's my turn to write a will of my own, not a fortune, though there will be one, and not a company, though there will be that too, but the plain, unglamorous certainty that no daughter of mine, by blood or by choice, ever has to kneel at anyone's gate waiting to be let into a life that was rightfully hers all along. Whatever else people remember about that summer, I hope that part is the one that lasts the longest. Not the ceremony, not the ring on the stage, not even the 18 years or the discharge papers. Just a woman who finally stood up, walked away from a gate that was never truly hers to be locked out of, and built a life sturdy enough that nobody ever got to lock her out of anything again. That is the story I will keep telling my son, for as long as he needs to hear it, and the story I will keep telling myself on the nights it still helps to remember exactly how far the two of us have come since that first blistering afternoon at the gate.